The flames took everything from her. Her home, her husband, her beauty. Now, 3 years later, Clara Patterson stood in the doorway of Miller's Forge, watching the town's new metalworker shape red-hot iron with hands that moved like poetry. She pulled her shawl tighter, hiding the twisted scars that crawled up her neck like angry vines. "I need horseshoes," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hammer's song. Nathan Brooks looked up, sweat glistening on his massive frame, and smiled with a warmth that made her step backward into the shadows. "Don't," she breathed, her fingers tracing the hidden marks beneath the fabric. "Don't look at me like that." But he was already walking toward her, his eyes holding something she'd forgotten existed in this world: tenderness. What happened next would shatter every wall she'd built around her wounded heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of burning leaves through Millbrook Valley, and Clara Patterson pulled her dark wool shawl closer as she made her way down the dusty main street. 3 years had passed since the fire, yet she still flinched at the sight of smoke rising from chimneys, still felt phantom flames licking at her skin when the sun grew too warm. The townspeople of Millbrook had grown accustomed to her peculiar ways, the way she kept to the shadows, spoke in whispers, and never ever let anyone see what lay beneath the high collar of her dress or the careful drape of her shawl. They whispered among themselves about the tragedy that had claimed the Patterson homestead, about poor Clara, who'd lost her husband Thomas in the blaze that had nearly taken her life too. But whispers were all they had, for Clara had built walls higher than the mountains that surrounded their valley, and she intended to keep them that way. This morning, however, necessity forced her from the sanctuary of her small cabin on the outskirts of town. Her mare, Rosie, had thrown a shoe, and without proper footwear the horse would be lame within days. Clara needed those shoes, needed Rosie healthy, because the horse was her lifeline to the outside world, her means of fetching supplies without having to linger long in places where people might stare. The old blacksmith, Heinrich Müller, had died the previous month, leaving the town without anyone skilled in metalwork. But word had spread that his replacement had finally arrived, a man named Nathan Brooks from somewhere back east, they said, a giant of a man with gentle hands and a mysterious past of his own. Clara hesitated outside Miller's Forge, the rhythmic ringing of hammer on anvil echoing from within. Through the open doorway, she could see the orange glow of the furnace, could feel its heat even from where she stood. Her scarred skin seemed to tighten in memory, and she nearly turned away. But Rosie needed those shoes. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing smoke, Clara stepped into the forge. The interior was a cathedral of fire and iron. Sparks danced in the air like fallen stars, and the massive bellows breathed life into flames that roared with primal hunger. At the center of it all stood a man who seemed carved from the same raw materials he worked with, broad shoulders that strained against his leather apron, arms thick with muscle earned through years of shaping stubborn metal into submission, and hands that wielded a hammer with the precision of an artist's brush. Nathan Brooks was everything the rumors had claimed and more. He stood well over 6 feet, with dark hair that caught copper highlights in the firelight, and a beard that framed a face both rugged and refined. But it was his eyes that made Clara's breath catch, deep brown, almost amber in the forge's glow, and filled with a kindness that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed barriers. He looked up as she entered, and his hammer paused. Mid-swing. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that somehow managed to be heard over the crackling flames. "How can I help you?" Clara pulled her shawl tighter, ensuring every inch of scarred skin remained hidden. "I need horseshoes," she whispered, her voice so soft he had to lean forward to catch her words. "For my mare. She's thrown one." Nathan set down his hammer and wiped his hands on a leather cloth. "Of course, let me just—" He started to move toward her, and Clara instinctively stepped back, her hand flying to her throat, where the worst of the scars began. The motion was so sharp, so filled with panic, that Nathan stopped immediately. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his massive frame somehow managing to make itself smaller, less threatening. "I didn't mean to startle you." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "The shoes," she managed. "How much?" $2 should cover it. But I'd like to see the horse first, to make sure I get the size right. Sometimes what looks like a thrown shoe is really... No!" The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "I mean, that won't be necessary. She's average-sized, nothing special." Nathan studied her for a moment, and Clara felt exposed under his gaze, despite the layers of wool and cotton that covered her from neck to wrist to ankle. There was something in his eyes, not pity exactly, but a recognition that made her skin crawl with anxiety. "All right," he said finally. "I can have them ready by tomorrow afternoon. Will that work?" Clara nodded, fumbling in her small purse for the coins. As she counted them out, her shawl slipped slightly, revealing just the barest edge of the scar tissue that crept up from her collarbone toward her jaw. It was barely visible, a shadow of twisted skin that most people would miss, but Nathan's sharp eyes caught it. His expression didn't change, didn't show the revulsion or pity she'd grown accustomed to seeing in others' faces. Instead, something flickered across his features that looked almost like understanding. "Mrs. Patterson, isn't it?" he asked gently, accepting the coins from her trembling fingers. "I heard about your loss, about the fire. I'm sorry." The kindness in his voice was like salt in an open wound. Clara's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed, and she turned toward the door. "Tomorrow afternoon," she managed, "Mrs. Patterson." Against her better judgment, she stopped. "The fire that took your husband," Nathan said quietly, "and hurt you. It wasn't your fault." The words hit her like a physical blow. Clara spun around, her composure finally cracking. "You don't know anything about it," she snapped, her whisper turning sharp with pain. "You don't know what I did, She cut herself off, horrified that she'd revealed so much. Without another word, she fled from the forge, Nathan's gentle voice calling her name as she disappeared into the safety of the shadowed street. But his words followed her home like persistent ghosts. "It wasn't your fault." If only he knew the truth. That night, Clara sat before the small mirror in her bedroom, finally allowing herself to look at what the fire had made of her. The scars began just above her collarbone and climbed like gnarled vines up her neck, across her left jaw, and into her hairline. They were raised and twisted, a map of agony written in damaged flesh that no amount of time seemed able to fade. But it wasn't just the physical marks that made her hideous. It was the knowledge of how she'd gotten them, the weight of the choice she'd made in those final, terrible moments when the flames had surrounded their small farmhouse. Thomas had been trapped beneath a fallen beam in their bedroom, his leg clearly broken, his face grey with pain. The fire was spreading fast, too fast. Clara had tried to lift the beam, had thrown her entire weight against it, but it wouldn't budge. The smoke was getting thicker, the heat more intense. "Go," Thomas had wheezed, his eyes already growing dim. "Clara, you have to go now." But she, who couldn't leave him, wouldn't leave him. So she'd made a choice that haunted her still. She'd thrown herself across his body, trying to shield him from the flames with her own flesh, hoping against hope that somehow they could weather the inferno. Together, the beam had shifted just as the ceiling began to collapse, trapping them both. Clara had felt the fire claim her neck and shoulder, had smelled her own skin burning as she pressed her face against Thomas's chest and waited to die beside the man she loved. The volunteer fire brigade had found her unconscious, her body curled protectively over Thomas's still form. They'd managed to pull her from the wreckage, but Thomas was already gone, not from the fire, the doctor said later, but from the smoke that had filled his lungs before Clara had even tried to shield him. She'd survived, scarred and broken, carrying the knowledge that her desperate attempt at heroism had been nothing more than a useless gesture that had nearly cost her life without saving him. The townspeople called her brave, a devoted wife who'd nearly died trying to save her husband. They didn't understand that she was a coward who'd been too afraid to face the world without Thomas, who'd chosen to burn rather than live alone. Now, 3 years later, she was still burning, just more slowly. Clara traced the worst of the scars with trembling fingers, remembering the way Nathan Brooks had looked at her in the forge. There had been no disgust in his eyes, no pity or fear, just that strange, warm recognition that suggested he understood something about living with pain. But understanding and acceptance were two different things. Clara had learned that lesson well over the past 3 years. People might feel sorry for her, might even admire her supposed sacrifice, but none of them wanted to touch her. None of them could look at her ruined face and see anything but damage. And that was fine. That was safer. Because if Nathan Brooks knew what she really was, not a brave wife, but a selfish coward who'd chosen to die rather than live, he'd look at her the way she looked at herself, with disgust. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next afternoon came too soon, and not soon enough. Clara found herself standing outside the forge again, her heart racing as she listened to the familiar sounds of metalwork from within. She'd considered sending word that she'd changed her mind, that she no longer needed the shoes, but practicality had won out over cowardice. Barely. This time, Nathan was waiting for her. He looked up as she entered, that same warm smile spreading across his soot-streaked face. "Right on time," he said, gesturing to a neat row of horseshoes cooling on his workbench. "I made several sizes just to be sure." Clara approached cautiously, keeping her distance as she examined his work. The shoes were beautifully crafted, each one a small work of art that spoke to the skill of their maker. They're very fine," she said softly. "Thank you." Nathan picked up one of the shoes, holding it up to catch the light. "I take pride in my work. Been at it for almost 15 years now." "What brought you to Millbrook?" Clara asked, then immediately regretted the question. She didn't want to make conversation, didn't want to risk revealing more of herself than she already had, but Nathan seemed to understand her discomfort. He set down the horseshoe and moved to the opposite side of the workbench, giving her space while he talked. "My wife died," he said simply, 2 years ago. Cancer. After that, I couldn't bear to stay in the same place where we'd been happy together. So I packed up and started moving west, taking work where I could find it. Millbrook seemed like a good place to stop for a while. The honest pain in his voice made Clara's chest tighten. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Thank you. She was everything good in the world. Losing her nearly broke me." Clara looked up at him then, really looked, and saw the shadow of old grief in his amber eyes. It was a look she recognized, a weight she carried herself. "How do you bear it?" she heard herself ask. "The loneliness?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his large hands absently arranging tools on his workbench. "Some days I don't," he admitted. "Some days I think about joining her wherever she's gone. But then I remember something she used to say when she was sick, when the pain was bad. What was that? That even broken things can be beautiful. Those scars don't make something ugly. They just tell its story." Clara's hand flew to her throat, her fingers tracing the hidden marks beneath her shawl. "That's easy to say when the damage isn't visible," she said bitterly. Nathan's eyes met hers across the workbench. "Who says my damage isn't visible?" "Before." Clara could ask what he meant. He began rolling up the sleeves of his work shirt. The scars that emerged were unlike anything she'd ever seen. Not the chaotic web of burn damage that marked her own skin, but deliberate, precise lines that crisscrossed his forearms like a map of deliberate pain. Clara's breath caught. "You did that to yourself?" "After Sarah died," Nathan said quietly, not bothering to hide the evidence of his darkest moments. "I couldn't feel anything but emptiness, so I tried to cut it out. Tried to make the inside hurt, match the outside hurt. It didn't work." The honesty of his admission left Clara speechless. In 3 years, no one had spoken to her about pain with such raw truth, such complete absence of shame or pretense. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. Nathan rolled his sleeves back down, but the knowledge of what lay beneath remained. Between them, like a shared secret, because sometimes it helps to know you're not the only one who's been broken, and because Sarah was right, scars do tell stories. Mine tell the story of a man who loved his wife so much that losing her almost killed him. But they also tell the story of a man who chose to keep living, even when living hurt. He picked up the horseshoes, wrapping them carefully in leather. "What story do your scars tell, Clara?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and terror. Clara took the wrapped shoes with hands that shook only slightly, her mind reeling from everything Nathan had shared. "That's $2, she managed, avoiding his question entirely. "Already paid for," Nathan said gently. "Yesterday, remember?" "Right. Yes. Thank you." Clara clutched the shoes to her chest like armor. "I should go." "Clara," she stopped at the threshold, not quite brave enough to turn around. "If you ever need anything, more shoes, repairs, or just someone to talk to who understands about scars, you know where to find me." Clara fled then, but this time she carried more than just horseshoes with her. She carried the image of Nathan's scarred forearms, the memory of his gentle voice, speaking truths she'd never heard before. And for the first time in 3 years, she carried something else too. Hope. The horseshoes sat unused in Clara's barn for 3 days. Every morning, she would saddle Rosie with the intention of riding to Nathan's forge to have them properly fitted. And every morning she would find some excuse to delay. The vegetable garden needed weeding. The cabin's roof had a loose shingle. The chickens required extra attention. Anything to avoid seeing Nathan Brooks again. But on the 4th morning, Mrs. Abernathy from the general store knocked on Clara's. A daughter with news that sent ice through her veins. "There's been another fire," the older woman announced, her face flushed from the urgent ride out to Clara's cabin. "The Henderson place, about 2 miles north of town. Lightning strike, they think. The family got out safe, but their barn's gone, and their house is badly damaged." Clara gripped the doorframe so tightly her knuckles went white. Did anyone get hurt?" "Young Billy Henderson has some burns on his hands where he tried to save their horses. Nothing like what you went through, dear, but the boys, in considerable pain. Doc Hendricks is doing what he can, but—" Mrs. Abernathy trailed off, her expression growing meaningful. "I remember how you helped tend the wounded after that terrible winter when half the town came down with pneumonia. You had such a gentle touch with the suffering. That was different," Clara said quickly. I don't help with burns. But you'd understand better than anyone what the boy's going through. Sometimes healing comes from someone who's walked the same dark path." Mrs. Abernathy's words echoed Nathan's from the forge, and Clara felt the familiar walls of her carefully constructed isolation beginning to crack. "I'm sorry, but I can't. Please give the Hendersons my sympathies." After Mrs. Abernathy left, Clara found herself pacing her small cabin like a caged animal. The image of Billy Henderson. She remembered him as a freckle-faced boy of perhaps 12, suffering with burned hands, kept intruding on her thoughts. She knew that particular agony intimately, knew how the damaged skin would feel like it was still burning days after the flames had been extinguished. She also knew she was the last person who should be offering comfort to anyone. That afternoon, unable to bear her own restlessness, Clara finally saddled Rosie and rode toward town. She told herself she was simply going to the general store for supplies, but her treacherous horse seemed to have other ideas. Before she realized it, they were standing outside Miller's forge once again. Nathan emerged from the building, as if he'd been waiting for her, wiping his hands on a leather cloth. Today, he wore a clean white shirt that made his dark hair and sun-bronzed skin appear even more striking, though Clara tried not to notice such things. "I was hoping you'd come back," he said, his voice carrying that same gentle warmth that had haunted her dreams. "How did the shoes fit?" "I haven't tried them yet," Clara admitted, then felt foolish for the confession. Nathan's expression grew concerned. "Is everything all right? If they're the wrong size—" "No, it's not that," Clara dismounted, keeping Rosie between herself and Nathan like a shield. "I heard about the Henderson fire." Understanding immediately dawned in Nathan's amber eyes. "Ah, that's why you look like you've seen ghosts." Billy Henderson was burned trying to save their horses. Clara's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Mrs. Abernathy thinks I should visit him, offer comfort. But you don't think you're the right person for that." It wasn't a question, and Clara appreciated that he didn't make her explain the obvious. "I couldn't even save my own husband. What comfort could I possibly offer? To anyone else?" Nathan was quiet for a moment, studying her with those perceptive eyes. "May I show you something?" Without waiting for an answer, he walked to the far corner of the forge, where a large wooden crate sat covered by a canvas tarp. When he pulled the covering away, Clara gasped. Inside the crate were dozens of small metal figurines, horses, birds, flowers, even tiny people engaged in various activities. Each piece was exquisitely crafted, showing a level of detail and artistry that transformed simple iron into something magical. "I made these for Sarah when she was dying," Nathan said quietly, picking up a small metal rose with petals so delicate. They seemed to flutter in the forge's heat. She loved beautiful things, but near the end she was too weak to tend her garden or care for her birds. So I tried to bring beauty to her bedside. Clara moved closer despite herself, drawn by the incredible craftsmanship. "They're magnificent." "She died before I finished the last one." Nathan set the rose back in its place with infinite care. "For the longest time afterward I thought they were useless. Just metal trinkets that hadn't saved her, hadn't even made her last days significantly better. What changed your mind?" Nathan smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, it was a smile entirely free of sadness. "A little girl in the last town where I worked. Her name was Emma, and she'd lost both parents in a cholera outbreak. She was staying with relatives who barely had enough food to feed their own children, and she hadn't spoken a word in months." He picked up a small metal bird, its wings spread in flight. "I gave her this, just a simple thing I'd made for Sarah. Emma took it and held it like it was made of gold instead of iron. She started carrying it everywhere, talking to it, making little nests for it out of grass and string." "Did she start speaking again?" "Eventually, but that's not the point." Nathan's eyes met Clara's across the crate. "The point is that something I'd made in love, even though it hadn't saved the person it was intended for, still had the power to bring comfort to someone else. My failure with Sarah didn't make the beauty worthless." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "You're saying I should visit Billy Henderson." "I'm saying that survival, even survival that feels like failure, can still be a gift to others. You know what it's like to burn, Clara. You know what it's like to live with scars. That knowledge, painful as it is, might be exactly what that boy needs to hear." Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A man she recognized as Jim Henderson came racing into town, his horse lathered with sweat and his face desperate with panic. "Nathan!" he called out, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Thank God you're here. It's Billy. He's taken. A turn for the worse. Doc Hendricks says the burns might be festering. He needs someone who understands wounds, someone who's dealt with infection before. Nathan immediately began gathering supplies from his forge. Clean cloth, a bottle of what looked like whiskey, and several metal instruments that Clara realized were probably used for more than just metalworking. "I'll come right away," he said. "I've dealt with infected burns before." Actually, Clara heard herself say, the words emerging before her courage could abandon her, "I'd like to come too." Both men turned to stare at her, and Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I mean, if you think it would help, I do know something about burns." Jim Henderson's expression shifted from surprise to desperate gratitude. "Mrs. Patterson, I'd be mighty thankful for any help you could offer. Billy's been asking for someone who understands what he's going through." Nathan's smile was warm enough to melt iron. "Let me saddle my horse." The ride to the Henderson place passed in tense silence, but Clara was acutely aware of Nathan riding beside her, his presence somehow both calming and unsettling. She caught herself glancing at his scarred forearms, remembering the courage it had taken for him to reveal those marks to her. Maybe she could find similar courage. The Henderson farmhouse showed the devastating effects of the fire: blackened timbers, broken windows, and the acrid smell of smoke still hanging in the air despite the days that had passed. Inside, they found Billy Henderson lying in a makeshift bed in the front room, his hands wrapped in what looked like increasingly soiled bandages. His face was flushed with fever, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. "Billy," his father said gently, "Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Brooks have come to help you." The boy's eyes opened, focusing with difficulty on Clara's face. "Are you the lady who was in the big fire?" he whispered. Clara nodded, moving closer to the bed. "Yes, I am." "Does it still hurt?" The question was asked with the directness of childhood, and Clara found herself answering with equal honesty. "Sometimes, but not the way it hurt at first." Nathan was already examining the boy's bandages with practiced efficiency. "These need to come off," he said quietly to Jim Henderson. "The wounds need to be cleaned properly, and I suspect some of the fabric has stuck to the burns." "Will it hurt?" Billy asked, his young voice tight with fear. Clara surprised herself by reaching out to smooth the hair back from his fevered brow. "It will hurt," she said honestly, "but Mr. Brooks and I will be as gentle as we can. And Billy, the pain won't last forever." What followed was one of the longest hours of Clara's life. She watched Nathan work with the burned hands with a skill that spoke to extensive medical experience, his massive fingers surprisingly deft as he cleaned infected tissue and applied fresh dressings. Throughout the process, Clara found herself talking to Billy, sharing pieces of her own experience that she'd never spoken aloud before. "The worst part isn't the pain," she told him as Nathan worked. "It's the fear that comes after. The worry that you'll never be the same again. Will I be able to use my hands normally?" Billy asked, his voice small. Clara looked at Nathan, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. "Your burns aren't as deep as mine were," she said carefully. "With proper care and time you should heal well. But even if you didn't, even if you carried scars forever, that wouldn't make you less than what you were before." "How do you know?" Clara felt Nathan's eyes on her as she struggled to find the right words. "Because I'm still here. I'm still living, still finding things to be grateful for. The scars changed me, but they didn't erase me." When Nathan finally finished rebandaging Billy's hands, the boy's fever had broken and his breathing had eased. Clara felt a strange sense of accomplishment, as if she'd participated in some small miracle. "Thank you," Jim Henderson said as they prepared to leave. "Both of you. I don't know what we would have done without your help." The ride back to town was different from the journey out. Clara felt lighter somehow, as if she'd left some invisible burden behind at the Henderson place. You were remarkable with him, Nathan said as they neared the outskirts of Millbrook. I just told him the truth. That's what made it remarkable. Nathan reined in his horse, causing Clara to stop as well. Can I ask you something? Clara's chest tightened with familiar anxiety, but she nodded. At the forge, when I told you about my scars, you asked why I was being so honest with you. I gave you an answer then. But it wasn't the whole truth. What's the whole truth? Nathan's amber eyes held hers steadily. The truth is that from the moment you walked into my forge, you reminded me of Sarah, not in looks or manner, but in the way you carry pain. Sarah spent months hiding her illness from everyone, convinced that her suffering made her a burden. It took me far too long to help her understand that sharing pain doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Clara felt her throat constrict. Nathan, I'm not saying this to make you uncomfortable, he continued gently. I'm saying it because I recognize the walls you've built around yourself. I built the same ones after Sarah died. But today, watching you with Billy Henderson, I saw those walls crack a little. I saw the real Clara Patterson, the woman who chose to face her fears because someone else needed help. You don't know what you're talking about, Clara whispered, but the protest lacked conviction. Don't I? Nathan dismounted and moved to stand beside her horse, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Clara, what happened in that fire, whatever you think you did wrong, it doesn't define you. Your capacity for compassion, your strength, your survival, those things define you. Clara felt tears she'd been holding back for 3 years begin to fall. You don't understand. I chose to die with him rather than live without him. That's not noble. It's selfish. And yet you lived anyway. You survived anyway. Maybe that wasn't a failure, Clara. Maybe that was grace. The words hit her like a physical blow, carrying a possibility she'd never dared to consider. Could survival itself be a gift, even when it wasn't what she'd intended? Nathan reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. His touch was warm and careful, treating her as if she were made of something precious rather than broken. Your scars don't make you ugly, Clara, he said softly. They make you real. They make you someone who can sit beside a frightened boy and help him believe he'll be all right again. For a moment, Clara allowed herself to lean into his touch, to imagine what it might be like to be seen as something other than damaged goods. But then reality crashed back and she pulled away. I should go home, she said, her voice unsteady. Nathan stepped back immediately, respect evident in every line of his body. Of course. But Clara, what we did today, helping Billy, we made a good team. As Clara rode toward home, those words echoed in her mind. A good team. When was the last time anyone had suggested she might be good at anything, might be a partner rather than a burden? That night, for the first time in 3 years, Clara stood before her mirror and tried to see what Nathan might see when he looked at her. The scars were still there, still twisted and angry-looking, still a map of her worst moment. But maybe, just maybe, they were also proof that she'd survived something terrible, and maybe survival, even imperfect survival, was its own kind of strength. The first snow of winter arrived 2 weeks after Billy Henderson's recovery, blanketing Millbrook Valley in pristine white that transformed the scarred landscape into something almost magical. Clara watched from her cabin window as the flakes danced past, each one unique and perfect in its brief existence before melting into the earth. She'd been thinking about snowflakes a lot lately, about how something so delicate could survive the violence of its creation, how beauty could emerge from chaos if you looked at it the right way. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her musings. Clara opened it to find Nathan standing on her porch, his dark coat dusted with snow and his breath visible in small clouds. In his hands he carried a wooden box that seemed to radiate warmth. "I brought you something," he said without preamble. "May I come in?" Clara hesitated. In the 2 weeks since they'd helped Billy Henderson together, Nathan had made several attempts to deepen their friendship, stopping by with supposedly urgent messages that could have waited, finding excuses to linger after their brief conversations. In town, each time, Clara had retreated behind her familiar walls, polite but distant, but something about the way he stood there, snow gathering on his shoulders and hope flickering in his amber eyes, made her step aside. "What's in the box?" she asked as he set it carefully on her small dining table. Instead of answering directly, Nathan opened the lid to reveal the most extraordinary sight Clara had ever beheld. Nestled in soft cloth lay a metal sculpture unlike anything she'd seen. Among his other works, a woman's figure, about the size of her hand, with flowing hair and graceful limbs. But what made Clara's breath catch wasn't the craftsmanship, exquisite though it was. It was the scars. Nathan had somehow captured in metal the exact pattern of burn damage that marked Clara's neck and shoulder, transforming twisted flesh into delicate filigree that seemed to dance across the figure's surface like living lace. "How did you—" Clara started, then stopped, her fingers hovering inches from the sculpture. "I have a good memory," Nathan said quietly. "I saw the edge of your scars that first day in the forge, and I've been thinking about them ever since. Not because they're ugly, Clara, but because they're part of something beautiful." Clara sank into the chair across from him, her eyes fixed on the metal woman who looked like her, but somehow seemed to embody everything she'd never been able to see in herself. "I don't understand." Nathan reached into the box again and withdrew a second figure. This one a man with deliberate lines carved into his arms, the same pattern of scars that marked Nathan's own flesh. "I made this one too. Together they tell a story." "What story?" Nathan placed the two figures side by side, and Clara saw that their poses complemented each other perfectly, the woman reaching toward the man's scarred arms opening to embrace her. The story of two people who thought their damage made them unlovable, until they found someone who understood that scars don't diminish beauty. They define it. The intimacy of the gesture, the hours of work he must have spent capturing every detail of her hidden marks, left Clara reeling. "Nathan, you shouldn't have—" "Why?" His voice carried a challenge she'd never heard before. "Because it makes you uncomfortable to be seen. Because it's easier to believe you're too broken to be cared for." The questions hit too close to home, and Clara stood abruptly, wrapping her shawl more tightly around herself. "You don't know what you're asking." "Then tell me." Nathan stood too, his imposing frame somehow managing to seem non-threatening despite his obvious intensity. "Help me understand why you're so determined to live like a ghost." "Because that's what I am." The words tore from Clara's throat with surprising violence. "I died in that fire, Nathan. Everything good in me burned away with Thomas. What's left isn't worth saving." "That's not true, isn't it?" Clara spun to face him, her composure finally cracking completely. "You want to know what really happened that night? You want to know why I have these scars?" Nathan nodded, his expression steady despite the storm building in Clara's eyes. "Thomas was trapped, pinned under a beam in our bedroom. The house was burning around us, and I knew that neither of us was getting out alive, so I made a choice." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I chose to die with him, rather than save myself. I threw myself on top of him, not to protect him from the flames, but because I was too cowardly to face life alone." She pulled her shawl away from her neck with shaking hands, fully exposing her scars for the first time in 3 years. "These marks? They're not badges of honor, Nathan. They're proof of my selfishness. I live because the fire brigade arrived in time to pull me out, not because I chose survival. And Thomas died anyway, not from the fire, but from smoke inhalation that happened before I even tried to shield him. My grand gesture was meaningless. Nathan looked at her exposed scars without flinching, his gaze taking in every twisted line, with the same careful attention he'd given his metal sculpture. "You're wrong about one thing," he said finally. "What? Your choice wasn't meaningless, it was human." He moved closer, slowly enough that Clara could retreat if she wanted to. She didn't. "Clara, you were faced with an impossible situation. Watching the man you loved die while knowing you couldn't save him. In that moment, you chose love over self-preservation. You chose to be with him in what you thought were his final moments, rather than abandon him to die alone. I chose to give up. You chose devotion." Nathan's hand rose slowly toward her face, stopping just short of touching her scarred cheek. "The fact that the outcome wasn't what you intended doesn't change the purity of your intent." Clara felt tears streaming down her face, 3 years of suppressed grief finally finding release. "But I lived, and he didn't. How is that fair?" "It's not fair. Death never is." Nathan's thumb brushed away her tears with infinite gentleness. "But life, messy, painful, imperfect life, that's what we have to work with. And Clara, what you've done with your life since that night proves you're not the selfish coward you think you are. What have I done? I've hidden away like a hermit, speaking to no one, helping no one. You helped Billy Henderson. You sat with him through his pain and showed him that survival was possible. You gave that boy hope when he needed it most." Clara shook her head, but Nathan continued before she could protest. "And before that fire, before Thomas died, what kind of person were you? Mrs. Abernathy mentioned that you used to help tend the sick. Jim Henderson knew to ask for your assistance because you had a reputation for compassion. The fire didn't create your capacity for caring, Clara. It just convinced you to hide it." Nathan's hands framed her face now, his scarred fingers tracing the edges of her damaged skin with reverence rather than revulsion. "These scars tell the story of a woman who loved so deeply she was willing to die for it. That's not something to be ashamed of. It's something rare and precious. Nathan, I'm not asking you to forget Thomas or pretend the fire didn't happen. I'm asking you to stop punishing yourself for surviving it." His forehead rested against hers, and Clara could feel the warmth of his breath on her lips. "I'm asking you to let someone else love you, scars and all." The word love hung between them like a bridge. Clara wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. "I don't know how," she whispered. "We'll figure it out together." Before Clara could lose her nerve, she reached up and touched Nathan's scarred forearms, tracing the deliberate lines he'd carved into his own flesh. "These tell a story too," she said softly. Nathan's breath caught. "What story do you see?" "The story of a man who loved so deeply that losing it almost destroyed him. A man who hurt himself because emotional pain felt too big to carry, but also," her fingers stilled on his skin, "the story of a man who chose to keep living anyway, who chose to channel his pain into something beautiful." Nathan's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "You see me clearly, Clara Patterson." "And you see me," Clara replied, the admission carrying the weight of revelation. "Even the parts I've tried to hide." The kiss, when it came, was nothing like the passionate embraces Clara remembered from her marriage to Thomas. This was gentler, more tentative, filled with the careful exploration of two people who'd learned to expect pain from the world. Nathan's lips touched hers with the same reverence he'd shown her scars, and Clara found herself responding with a tenderness she'd thought had died in the fire. When they finally broke apart, Clara's eyes were wet with tears that felt different from the ones she'd shed before, cleaner somehow, less bitter. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I." Nathan's thumb traced the line of her jaw, following the edge of her scar. "But I'd rather be scared with you than alone without you." Clara leaned into his touch, allowing herself for the first time to imagine what it might be like to be truly seen, truly known and loved anyway. "The whole town will talk. They'll say it's too soon, that I'm betraying Thomas's memory." "Let them talk. Thomas is gone, Clara, and you're not. You have a right to happiness, to love, to a future that honors your past without being imprisoned by it." Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake unique and perfect despite the violence of its journey from cloud to earth. Clara thought about that, about how beauty could emerge from chaos, how survival itself could be a form of grace. "Nathan?" "Yes?" "The metal sculptures you made, may I touch them?" Nathan nodded, watching as Clara approached the figures on her table. She picked up the woman first, marveling at the weight and warmth of the metal, at how Nathan had transformed her ugliest memories into something that caught the lamplight and threw it back, transformed. "She's beautiful," Clara murmured. "She's you." Clara set the figure down and picked up its companion, the scarred man with arms open in welcome. "And this is you?" "As I hope to be, as I want to be for you." Clara placed the two figures together, again, studying the way they reached for each other across the small space that separated them. What happens next in their story? Nathan moved to stand behind her, his arms coming around her waist with careful gentleness. Whatever they choose to write, whatever they're brave enough to create together. Clara leaned back against his solid warmth, feeling truly safe for the first time since the fire. The scars on her neck were still there, would always be there, but Nathan's presence made them feel less like marks of shame and more like evidence of her capacity to endure. "I want to try," she whispered. "To write a new story, I mean. With you." "Are you sure?" Clara turned in his arms, meeting his gaze with eyes that were finally free of the shadows that had haunted them for 3 years. "I'm sure that I'm tired of being afraid. I'm sure that what happened to Billy Henderson showed me I still have something to offer the world. And I'm sure that you see something in me worth loving, even if I can't see it yet myself." Nathan's smile could have melted the snow outside. "That's enough. That's more than enough to build on." As if to seal their tentative new beginning, Nathan reached for Clara's shawl, where she dropped it on the floor and gently draped it around her shoulders, not to hide her scars, but to keep her warm. The gesture was so simple, so accepting, that Clara felt the last of her walls crumble. "Will you stay for dinner?" she asked. "I could cook something and we could talk, really talk." "I'd like nothing better." As Clara moved around her small kitchen, preparing a simple meal, while Nathan sat at her table arranging his metal sculptures in the lamplight, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, the ordinary magic of domestic happiness. Not the desperate, all-consuming love she'd shared with Thomas, but something quieter, deeper, the kind of love built on mutual understanding and acceptance. It was the kind of love that could weather scars, both visible and hidden. It was the kind of love worth surviving for. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Millbrook Valley in a blanket of forgiving white. Inside Clara's warm cabin, 2 damaged souls began the careful work of healing, not by pretending their wounds didn't exist, but by choosing to see beauty in the very marks that told their stories. And for the first time since the fire, Clara Patterson allowed herself to believe that her story wasn't over. It was just beginning a new chapter. Spring came early to Millbrook Valley that year, melting the winter snow into rushing streams that sang their way toward the distant river. Clara stood in her vegetable garden, her hands deep in the rich earth as she planted seeds that would bloom into sustenance. For the first time in 4 years, she found herself planning for a future that extended beyond mere survival. 3 months had passed since that snowy evening when Nathan had shown her the metal sculptures. 3 months of careful courtship that had slowly transformed both their lives. Nathan had been patient with her fears, gentle with her hesitations, and Clara had surprised herself by gradually opening like one of the flowers she now coaxed from the soil. The townspeople had indeed talked just as Clara had predicted. Some whispered that it was too soon, that she was dishonoring Thomas's memory. Others suggested that Nathan was taking advantage of a damaged woman's loneliness. But there had been unexpected supporters too. Mrs. Abernathy, who claimed she'd never seen Clara look so alive. Doc Hendricks, who noted that Clara's nightmares seemed to have stopped. And most surprisingly, Jim Henderson, who credited Clara and Nathan's partnership with saving his son's life. This morning brought a new challenge to their fragile happiness. Mayor Whitman had arrived at Clara's cabin just after dawn, with news that made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "There's going to be a town celebration next month," he announced, his round face flushed with excitement. "A spring festival to celebrate the community surviving another hard winter. We're hoping everyone will participate, bring food, help with decorations, maybe share talents or stories." Clara's hands stilled in the soil. The thought of being surrounded by the entire population of Millbrook, of being the center of attention even briefly, sent ice through her veins. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that kind of gathering." "Nonsense," Mayor Whitman beamed. "Mrs. Patterson, you and Mr. Brooks have become quite the team around here. Between his metalworking skills and your way with healing, you've both earned your place in this community. Besides, I was hoping you might consider sharing your story at the festival." "My story?" "About surviving the fire, about finding hope again. Young Billy Henderson has been telling everyone how much your visit helped him. I think your experience could inspire others who are struggling with their own difficulties." After Mayor Whitman left, Clara sat in her garden, feeling the familiar weight of panic settle on her chest. The idea of standing before the entire town, of exposing her private pain for public consumption, felt impossible. She was still sitting there an hour later when Nathan arrived for their daily visit. His approach, announced by the cheerful whistling that had become as much a part of Clara's mornings as sunrise itself. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he observed, settling beside her on the wooden bench they'd built together the previous week. Clara explained Mayor Whitman's request, watching Nathan's expression grow thoughtful. "He wants me to tell my story to the entire town, to inspire them with my miraculous recovery, and that terrifies you. Wouldn't it terrify you? Standing up there pretending to be some kind of hero when I know the truth about what really happened?" Nathan was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the neat rows of seedlings Clara had planted. "Can I tell you about the last conversation I had with Sarah?" Clara nodded, still unused to hearing him speak freely about his late wife, but grateful for his willingness to share. She was very weak by then, could barely speak above a whisper, but she took my hand and said, "Nathan, promise me something. Promise me you won't let my death make you forget how to live." His voice roughened slightly. I told her I couldn't. Imagine living without her, and she smiled. God, Clara, even dying she had the most beautiful smile, and she said, "Then don't live without me. Carry the best parts of our love forward and use them to love someone else." Clara felt her throat tighten. "That's beautiful, Nathan, but I don't see how—" For 2 years after she died, I thought honoring her memory meant staying frozen in grief. I thought moving forward would be a betrayal. Nathan turned to face Clara fully. "But that night in your cabin, when you let me see your scars and you touched mine, I finally understood what Sarah meant. She wasn't asking me to forget her or replace her. She was asking me to let our love transform into something that could help heal the world's pain. What does that have to do with the festival?" Nathan reached for Clara's soil-stained hands, intertwining their fingers with the same gentle reverence. He'd shown that first evening. "Your story, the real story, including the parts you're ashamed of, has the power to help people who are carrying their own guilt and self-blame. Not because you're perfect or heroic, but because you're human. Nathan, I can't stand up there and pretend. Then don't pretend. Tell the truth. Tell them about loving Thomas so much that you chose to die with him rather than live without him. Tell them about the guilt you've carried, about the nights you've wondered if survival was a blessing or a curse. Tell them about learning to see your scars as proof of your capacity to love rather than marks of shame. Clara stared at him, her heart racing. You're suggesting I expose everything? All of it? I'm suggesting you trust this community with your truth the same way you trusted me. Clara, you've spent 4 years hiding because you thought your story was too ugly to share. But ugly stories are often the ones people need to hear most. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A small group of riders was making their way up the path to her cabin. People she recognized from town, but more than she'd ever had visited at once. Abernathy dismounted first, followed by Doc Hendricks, Jim Henderson, and his son Billy, whose hands were now completely healed. Behind them came several other townspeople Clara knew by sight, but had barely spoken to in years. We heard about Mayor Whitman's request, Mrs. Abernathy announced without preamble, about asking you to speak at the festival. Clara's stomach dropped. If you've come to tell me I shouldn't participate, quite the opposite, Doc Hendricks interrupted. We've come to tell you that we hope you'll say yes. Billy Henderson stepped forward, his young face serious with purpose. Mrs. Patterson, that day when you came to help me, you told me something I've never forgotten. You said that scars don't make something ugly, they just tell its story. Billy, let me finish, please. The boy's voice carried a maturity that spoke to how much he'd grown since the fire. I've been thinking about that ever since. About how you sat with me when I was scared and hurting. And you didn't try to tell me everything would be perfect. You told me it would be hard, but that I could bear it. That survival was its own kind of courage. Jim Henderson placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder. What Billy's trying to say is that your honesty helped him more than any false comfort could have. You gave him permission to be afraid, while also giving him hope. There are others in town who could use that same gift, Mrs. Abernathy added gently. Widow Morrison, whose husband died in the mine collapse last year. Young Samuel Tucker, who's been struggling since he came back from the war with shaking hands and nightmares. The Garrett family, who lost their youngest to scarlet fever and blamed themselves for not calling the doctor sooner. Clara felt overwhelmed by the weight of so much need, so much pain, that she might be able to ease. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You don't have to be strong, Doc Hendricks said kindly. You just have to be honest. Clara, in my 40 years of practicing medicine, I've learned that sometimes the best healing comes not from someone who has all the answers, but from someone who has walked through darkness and lived to tell about it. After the group left, Clara found herself walking the perimeter of her property with Nathan, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows that reminded her of the way firelight had danced on the walls of her burning home. I keep thinking about Thomas, she said finally. About what he would want me to do. What do you think he'd want? Clara considered the question carefully. He always said I had a gift for comforting people. He used to joke that I could calm a wild horse just by talking to it softly enough. A smile ghosted across her lips at the memory. I think he'd want me to use whatever wisdom I've gained to help others, even if it meant revealing things that make me uncomfortable. And what do you want? The question was harder to answer. Clara had spent so many years focused on survival, on simply getting through each day, that she'd almost forgotten she was allowed to want things for herself. I want to matter, she said softly. I want my pain to serve some purpose beyond just making me miserable. I want to honor both Thomas's memory and your faith in me. Nathan stopped walking and pulled Clara into his arms, holding her against his chest while evening settled around them. Then you have your answer. I'm still terrified. No, but Clara, you won't be alone up there. I'll be in the crowd, and so will everyone who came to see you today. You'll be surrounded by people who care about you, people who want to hear what you have to say. Clara pulled back enough to meet his eyes. Will you help me figure out what to say? How to tell the story in a way that might actually help people? Of course, but Clara, the story is already inside you. It's been growing since the day we met, through every choice you've made to keep living, to keep caring, to let yourself be loved despite your scars. That evening, they sat at Clara's kitchen table with sheets of paper spread between them, working together to shape her experiences into something that might serve others. Nathan proved to be an unexpectedly gifted collaborator, asking questions that helped Clara see her own journey with new clarity. What would you tell someone who was facing their own fire? He asked. Someone who was afraid they wouldn't survive. Their worst moment? Clara thought for a long time before answering. I'd tell them that survival isn't always pretty or noble. Sometimes it's messy and accidental, and it leaves you marked. But being marked doesn't mean being ruined. It means being real, being human, being someone who has wrestled with darkness and lived to see another dawn. Nathan smiled as he wrote her words down. And what would you tell someone who was struggling with guilt? Someone who thought their choices had caused irreparable harm. I'd tell them that guilt can be a teacher if we let it, but it doesn't have to be a prison. That the fact that we feel remorse means we have the capacity for growth, for becoming better than we were in our worst moments. As they worked, Clara felt something shifting inside her, a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since before. The fire. Her story wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about transformation, about learning to see beauty in brokenness, strength in vulnerability, hope in the midst of despair. Nathan? Yes? Thank you. For seeing something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. Nathan reached across the table and took her scarred hand in his. Clara, you saved yourself. I just had the privilege of witnessing your resurrection. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, each one a distant light that had traveled across unimaginable darkness to reach them. Clara thought about that journey, about how light could survive the vast emptiness of space, how it could emerge from its trials not diminished but transformed, carrying warmth to worlds that desperately needed illumination. Maybe that was what healing looked like. Not the erasure of damage, but the transformation of pain into something that could light the way for others walking similar paths. Maybe that was what love looked like too, not the absence of scars, but the courage to let someone trace those scars with gentle fingers and call them beautiful. As Clara and Nathan continued planning her festival speech, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line beyond her property. Someone who had been observing their growing closeness with increasing agitation. Someone who believed that Clara Patterson's newfound happiness was an affront to the memory of the dead. Someone who was determined to remind her that some sins could never be forgiven, no matter how beautifully they were reframed. The shadow moved silently through the darkness, carrying plans that would test everything Clara and Nathan had built together. But that reckoning lay ahead, hidden in the approaching festival like a serpent coiled among spring flowers. For now, in the warm circle of lamplight, two scarred souls continued the sacred work of healing, unaware that their hardest trial still awaited them. The morning of the spring festival dawned bright and clear, with the kind of crystalline air that made every color seem more vivid, every sound more sharp. Clara stood before her bedroom mirror, her hands trembling as she attempted to braid her hair into something presentable. In just a few hours, she would stand before the entire population of Millbrook and bare her soul in ways she'd never imagined possible. The dress she'd chosen was one Thomas had particularly loved, deep blue cotton, with small white flowers embroidered around the neckline. She'd altered it the previous week, lowering the collar enough that her scars would be visible to anyone who looked closely. If she was going to tell her story honestly, she reasoned, she needed to look like the woman who had lived it. A gentle knock at her door interrupted her anxious preparations. Clara opened it to find Nathan standing on her porch, looking unusually formal in a pressed white shirt and dark vest. In his hands, he carried a small wooden box tied with a blue ribbon. "You look beautiful," he said simply, his amber eyes taking in her appearance with unconcealed admiration. Clara's hand flew instinctively to her throat, where the edge of her scars was clearly visible above her dress's neckline. "Nathan, I'm not sure I can do this. What if I freeze up there? What if I say the wrong thing?" Instead of offering empty reassurances, Nathan stepped inside and set the wooden box on her table. "Then you'll be human, and that's exactly what people need to see." He untied the ribbon with careful fingers. "I made you something for today. A reminder." Inside the box lay a delicate silver chain, and hanging from it was a small metal pendant. Unlike anything Clara had ever seen, it was shaped like a flame. But instead of being destructive and chaotic, this flame seemed to dance with joy, its edges crafted to catch and reflect light in dozens of tiny rainbows. "It's beautiful," Clara breathed, lifting the pendant to examine Nathan's intricate work. "It's a reminder that fire doesn't just destroy, it also purifies, transforms, creates. The same flames that scarred you also forged you into someone stronger. Someone capable of lighting the way for others." Nathan moved behind her, taking the chain from her trembling hands. "May I?" Clara nodded, lifting her hair so he could fasten the necklace around her throat. The pendant settled just above her heart, its weight somehow comforting rather than burdensome. "Perfect," Nathan murmured, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck with familiar tenderness. "Now you carry a different kind of fire with you, one that warms instead of burns." They walked to the festival grounds together, Clara's hand tucked securely in the crook of Nathan's arm. The entire town square had been transformed overnight into something magical. Colorful bunting stretched between the buildings, tables groaning under the weight of contributed food, and a makeshift stage had been erected in the center of it all. As they approached, Clara was surprised to see how many people were already gathered. Not just the residents of Millbrook, but folks from neighboring settlements who had traveled to participate in the celebration. Children ran between the adults, their laughter mixing with the sound of fiddle music that drifted from near the church. Mrs. Abernathy hurried over as soon as she spotted them, her face bright with excitement. "Clara! Nathan! Perfect timing! Mayor Whitman wants to start the speaking portion in about an hour. Are you ready?" Clara's stomach lurched, but Nathan's steady presence beside her kept her from fleeing. "As ready as I'll ever be." "Wonderful. Oh, and Clara, there are some people here specifically to hear you speak. Word has spread to the other towns about what you did for Billy Henderson, and several folks have come hoping to meet the woman who helped him heal." The news should have been encouraging, but it only increased Clara's anxiety. More strangers to judge her story, more people who might see through her carefully constructed courage to the frightened woman beneath. As if sensing her mounting panic, Nathan squeezed her hand. "One story at a time," he murmured. "One person at a time. That's all any of us can manage." The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and nervous small talk. Clara met the families Mrs. Abernathy had mentioned. People carrying their own griefs and fears, their own questions about survival and purpose. She was struck by how many of them seemed to be looking to her for answers she wasn't sure she possessed. Finally, Mayor Whitman took the stage and called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us in celebrating another successful year in Millbrook Valley. We've weathered harsh winters, difficult harvests and personal trials, but we've done it together, as a community. Applause rippled through the crowd, and Clara felt Nathan's hand find hers again, steadying her for what was to come. Today, we're honored to have several of our neighbors share their stories of resilience and hope, the mayor continued. But first, I'd like to invite Mrs. Clara Patterson to the stage. Many of you know her story already, but for those who don't, Clara survived a terrible fire 4 years ago that took her husband and left her severely injured. What you might not know is how her journey of healing has become a source of strength for others in our community. Clara's legs felt like water as she made her way to the stage, but Nathan's encouraging nod gave her the courage to climb the wooden steps. Standing before the assembled crowd, she could see faces both familiar and strange, all turned toward her with expressions of curiosity and expectation. For a moment, her carefully prepared words deserted her entirely. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and Clara could feel heat rising in her cheeks. Then her gaze found Nathan in the crowd, his amber eyes full of love and faith, and she remembered why she was here. "I'm not sure what most of you expect to hear from me today," Clara began, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder this time. "When Mayor Whitman asked me to speak, he suggested I might inspire you with my story of survival, but the truth is, I don't feel very inspired." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Clara saw several people lean forward with increased interest. 4 years ago, my husband Thomas and I lost everything in a house fire. Thomas died, and I was left with scars that serve as daily reminders of that terrible night. For 3 years afterward, I lived like a ghost, barely speaking to anyone, hiding from the world, convinced that my survival was some kind of cruel joke. Clara touched the flame pendant at her throat, drawing strength from its presence. "I want to tell you what really happened that night, because I think the truth might be more useful than any pretty lies about heroism or divine intervention." She took a deep breath and continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Thomas was trapped under a fallen beam in our bedroom. I knew we were both going to die. The fire was too big, too fast. I had a choice. I could try to save myself, or I could stay with him. I chose to stay, not because I was brave, but because I was too afraid to face life without him." The crowd had grown completely silent now, hanging on her every word. I threw myself on top of Thomas, thinking we would die together. But the fire brigade arrived in time to pull me out. Thomas was already gone, not from the fire, but from smoke inhalation that happened before I ever tried to protect him. My grand gesture had been meaningless. Clara could see tears in some eyes, recognition in others. She pressed on, knowing this was the crucial moment. For 3 years I carried the weight of that failure. I believed my scars marked me as selfish, as someone who had chosen death over life and been denied even that escape. I hid from all of you because I was ashamed, not of how I looked, but of what I thought I was. She gestured toward the crowd, finding Billy Henderson's face among them. Then something happened that changed everything. Billy Henderson was burned in a fire, and people asked me to help because they thought I would understand his pain. I didn't want to go. I didn't think I had anything valuable to offer. Billy smiled at her from the crowd, his healed hands applauding silently. But when I sat with that frightened boy, when I saw my own terror reflected in his young eyes, I realized something important. My experience with pain, even pain born from what I considered failure, had given me something precious. It has given me the ability to sit with someone else's suffering without trying to fix it or explain it away. Clara felt tears threatening, but she pushed through them. I learned that healing doesn't always look like we think it should. Sometimes it's not about becoming unmarked or returning to who we were before. Sometimes it's about learning to carry our wounds with dignity, to let our scars tell stories of survival instead of shame. Now she looked directly at Nathan, whose expression was radiant with pride and love. I also learned that we don't have to carry our burdens alone. There are people in this world, rare, precious people, who can look at our damage and see not ugliness, but proof of our capacity to endure, who can love us not despite our scars, but because of what those scars represent. The crowd was completely still now, and Clara realized she had their absolute attention. She took a deep breath for the final part of her speech. I'm not here to tell you that everything happens for a reason, or that suffering makes us stronger, or any of the other things people say to make sense of senseless pain. What I'm here to tell you is that surviving, even surviving messily, even surviving when we didn't mean to, is its own form of courage. That carrying on when life has wounded, and is not resignation, but rebellion. Clara's voice broke slightly as she reached her conclusion. To those of you who are struggling with guilt, with loss, with the feeling that you're too damaged to deserve happiness, I want you to know that your wounds do not define your worth. Your scars, visible or hidden, are proof that you have wrestled with darkness and lived to see another day. That is no small thing. That is everything. She stepped back from the center of the stage, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the entire crowd could hear it. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then one person began to clap. Nathan, his scarred hands coming together with fierce pride. The sound was quickly taken up by others until the entire crowd was applauding with an enthusiasm that took Clara's breath away. But even as she basked in the warmth of their acceptance, Clara noticed something that made her blood run cold. At the very edge of the crowd, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, stood a figure she recognized with a shock of fear. Thomas's brother, Marcus Patterson, had come to the festival, and from the expression on his weathered face, he had not come to celebrate Clara's newfound happiness. Marcus had always blamed Clara for his brother's death, had made his feelings clear at Thomas's funeral when he'd publicly questioned why God would spare the wife and take the husband. He'd left town shortly after, but now he was back, and his presence felt like a storm cloud gathering on Clara's horizon. As people began to approach the stage to congratulate her on her speech, Clara tried to push aside her worry about Marcus. Whatever he wanted, whatever he intended to do, she would face it. She was no longer the broken woman who had hidden from the world for 3 years, but even as she accepted the kind words and tearful thanks of her neighbors, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her hardest test was yet to come. Nathan appeared at her side as the crowd began to thin, his face glowing with pride. Clara, that was extraordinary. You moved people in ways they'll remember for years. Did you see? Clara began, then stopped as she looked toward the oak tree. Marcus was gone, disappeared as silently as he had appeared. See what? Clara forced. A smile, not wanting to spoil Nathan's joy with her fears. Nothing, just thought I saw someone I recognized. But as they walked home together through the lengthening shadows of evening, Clara couldn't escape the feeling that Marcus Patterson's return was no coincidence. He had heard about her relationship with Nathan, about her newfound happiness, and he had come back to Millbrook for a reason. That night, as she and Nathan sat on her porch swing, sharing the quiet contentment that followed her successful speech, Clara tried to hold on to the peace of the moment. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges it brought. Tonight, she was surrounded by love, acceptance, and the profound satisfaction of having helped others by sharing her truth. But in the darkness beyond her garden, shadows moved with purpose, and the sound of horses' hooves on packed earth suggested that Marcus Patterson was not alone. Clara's resurrection was about to face its ultimate test. The attack came 3 nights after the festival, when Clara was alone. Nathan had ridden to the next valley to deliver some custom metalwork to a rancher, expecting to return by nightfall. But his horse had thrown a shoe on the mountain trail. forcing him to spend the night at a way station and leaving Clara unprotected when Marcus Patterson finally made his move. Clara was reading by lamplight in her front room when the first stone shattered her window. Glass exploded inward, showering her with glittering fragments that caught the firelight like malevolent stars. She dropped her book and instinctively pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering with terror that transported her instantly back to the night of the fire. "Clara Patterson!" Marcus's voice boomed from the darkness outside, slurred with whiskey, but clear in its fury. "Come out here and face what you've done." Clara crept toward the broken window, careful to avoid the glass scattered across her floor. Through the jagged opening, she could see 3 figures on horseback. Marcus in the center, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize. All 3 held burning torches that cast dancing shadows across their faces, making them look like demons risen from her worst nightmares. "I know you're in there. You're murdering a witch," Marcus shouted, his horse prancing nervously beneath him. "Playing the grieving widow while you take up with another man like my brother never mattered." Clara's breath came in short, panicked gasps. The sight of the torches, the smell of smoke drifting through the broken window, the echo of flames, crackling, everything conspired to drag her back to that terrible night 4 years ago. Her scars began to ache as if the fire were consuming her flesh all over again. "Please," she called out, her voice barely audible. "Marcus, please just go. I never meant any harm." "No harm." Marcus's laugh was ugly with rage. "You killed him. You killed Thomas as surely as if you'd put a gun to his head. And now you parade around town with your new lover, making speeches about survival, while my brother rots in the ground." Another stone flew through the window, this one striking the wall just inches from Clara's head. She cried out and stumbled, backward, tripping over her overturned chair and landing hard on her kitchen floor among the scattered glass. "The whole town knows what you really are now," one of Marcus's companions yelled. "We heard your pretty speech about how you chose to die with him. You didn't choose anything. You were too much of a coward to save him when you had the chance." Clara crawled toward her back door, glass cutting through her dress and into her knees. She had to get out, had to run, but where could she go? Nathan was gone, and these men on horseback would catch her easily if she tried to flee on foot. The torches were moving now, circling her cabin like predatory animals. Through her windows, Clara could see the orange glow getting brighter, closer. The smell of smoke was growing stronger, and with horrible certainty she realized what Marcus intended. He was going to burn her out. "You want to know what really happened that night?" Marcus bellowed, his voice carrying clearly through the thin cabin walls. "Thomas was trapped, but he was still alive when the fire started. You could have saved him if you'd acted fast enough. If you'd been brave enough to leave his side and get help." Clara pressed her hands over her ears, but Marcus's words penetrated anyway. "Instead, you lay there playing the devoted wife while my brother suffocated. You let him die so you could feel righteous about your sacrifice, and now you want everyone to think you're some kind of hero." The first flames appeared at her kitchen window. Not the main fire yet, but Marcus testing kindling against her cabin walls. Clara's vision blurred with panic as the familiar orange glow began to flicker across her walls. She was trapped again, surrounded by fire and smoke and the certainty of death. But then something shifted inside her. Maybe it was the memory of Nathan's gentle hands tracing her scars. Maybe it was the echo of the crowd's applause after her festival speech. Maybe it was simply the accumulated strength of 4 years of survival, 4 years of choosing to wake up each morning despite the pain. Whatever it was, Clara felt her panic crystallize into something harder, cleaner, fury. She pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the glass that bit into her palms, and marched to her front door. Throwing it open, she stepped onto her porch and faced the 3 mounted men with their torches in their rage. "You want to burn me out, Marcus?" she called, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength. Then look me in the eye while you do it. Marcus pulled up short, clearly not expecting her to emerge from hiding. In the torchlight, Clara could see that he looked older than his 35 years, his face ravaged by grief and alcohol, his eyes holding the hollow look of a man who had let bitterness consume him from within. "You murdered my brother," he said, but some of the fire had gone out of his voice. "No," Clara replied, walking to the edge of her porch despite the danger. "I loved your brother. I loved him so much that when I thought we were both going to die, I chose to die beside him rather than abandon him. You call that cowardice, but Nathan calls it devotion. Which one of you is right, Marcus? Don't you dare speak his name." Marcus raised his torch higher, and Clara could see him struggling with whether to follow through on his threat. "You don't deserve to find happiness when Thomas is dead." "You're right," Clara said quietly, and Marcus blinked in surprise. "I don't deserve happiness, neither do you. Neither does anyone, really. Happiness isn't something we earn, Marcus. It's something we choose to accept when it's offered to us." She gestured toward the flames at her kitchen window, which were beginning to catch hold of the dry wood. "You can burn me out if you want. You can destroy everything I've built here. But Marcus, will that bring Thomas back? Will that make your pain any less?" One of Marcus's companions shifted restlessly in his saddle. "Marcus, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Marcus snapped, but Clara could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. "I know you blame me for surviving when he didn't," Clara continued, stepping down from her porch despite the danger. "I blame myself for the same thing for 3 years. But Marcus, listen to me. Thomas wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want you destroying yourself with hatred any more than he'd want me destroying myself with guilt. You don't know what he'd want." Marcus's voice cracked with anguish. "He was my little brother. I was supposed to protect him, and—" There it was, the real source of Marcus's rage. Not just grief for his brother, but the crushing weight of survivor's guilt that Clara knew intimately. Marcus blamed her for Thomas's death because it was easier than blaming himself for not being there to prevent it. "Marcus," Clara said gently, taking another step closer despite the danger. "I understand. The guilt, the anger, the feeling that you failed someone you loved. I understand all of it. But burning down my cabin won't absolve either of us." For a moment, Marcus looked like he might listen. His torch wavered, and Clara thought she saw tears glittering in his eyes. But then his face hardened again, and he raised the flame toward her cabin's roof. "It's too late," he said roughly. "I can't live with what I've become. If I can't have peace, why should you?" The torch arced through the air, and Clara watched in horror as it landed on her roof with a shower of sparks. The dry shingles caught immediately, flames spreading across the surface like eager fingers reaching for destruction. But even as her home began to burn around her, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in 4 years of nightmares. She wasn't afraid. The realization hit her with stunning clarity. She was standing in front of a burning building, surrounded by the smell of smoke and the roar of flames. And she wasn't collapsing into panic. She was angry, hurt, defiant, but she wasn't afraid. "You're making a mistake, Marcus," she called, out as the 3 men prepared to ride away, their work of vengeance complete. But it's not too late to make a different choice. Marcus turned in his saddle, his face a mask of grief and rage. "Yes, it is, for all of us." They disappeared into the darkness, leaving Clara alone with her burning cabin. She stood in her yard, watching the flames consume her home, the same home where she'd spent 4 years hiding from the world, the same rooms where Nathan had first shown her his scars, where they'd planned her festival speech, where she'd slowly learned to live again. 2. Fire was beautiful in its way, Clara realized, with detached fascination. Destructive, yes, but also transformative. As she watched, her old life literally went up in smoke. Her furniture, her clothes, her books, all the physical reminders of who she'd been before Nathan Brooks had walked into her world. But the fire couldn't touch what really mattered, the memories they'd created, the love they'd discovered, the woman she'd become through surviving her own resurrection. Clara was still standing there, watching her cabin burn, when Nathan came thundering up the path on his lathered horse. He must have seen the glow from miles away, and must have known immediately what it meant. He was off his mount before it had fully stopped, his strong arms wrapping around Clara with desperate relief. "Thank God," he breathed into her hair. "I saw the flames and thought, Clara, are you hurt?" "I'm all right," she said, and was surprised to discover it was true. Marcus Patterson came back. He brought friends. Nathan's embrace tightened, but when he pulled back to examine her face, his eyes were blazing with anger. "Did he touch you? If he hurt you—" "He didn't touch me," Clara assured him. "He burned me out. But he didn't touch me." Nathan looked at the inferno that had been Clara's home, his jaw tight with fury. "We'll find him. We'll make him pay for this." "No." Clara's response surprised them both. "Nathan, no. This ends here." "Clara, he destroyed your home. He could have killed you, but he didn't." Clara turned to face the fire again, Nathan's arms still around her from behind. "And you know what's strange? I'm not afraid. I should be terrified. This is exactly like the night Thomas died. But all I feel is free." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, studying her profile in the firelight. Free. That cabin held 4 years of hiding, 4 years of shame and self-hatred. Marcus thought he was destroying me, but maybe he was actually setting me free. Clara leaned back against Nathan's solid warmth. "I can't live in the past anymore, Nathan. Thomas is gone. My old life is literally burning away, and Marcus will have to find his own path to healing. But I'm here, you're here, and that's enough to build something new on." As if summoned by her words, figures began emerging from the darkness. Townspeople who had seen the fire and came to help. Mrs. Abernathy arrived with blankets and offers of shelter. Doc Hendricks came with his medical bag in case anyone was injured. Jim Henderson and his son, Billy, appeared with buckets to fight the flames. Though the cabin was clearly beyond saving, even more surprising was the arrival of Mayor Whitman with several other town officials, their faces grim with purpose. "Mrs. Patterson," the mayor said, approaching Clara and Nathan where they stood watching the controlled destruction. "We saw Marcus Patterson and 2 other men riding hard out of town about an hour ago. Are you saying he's responsible for this?" Clara nodded, suddenly exhausted now that the immediate danger had passed. "He blamed me for Thomas's death. I think tonight was his way of trying to find some kind of justice." "This isn't justice," Mayor Whitman said firmly. "This is arson and attempted murder. We've already sent riders after them, and they'll face the full consequences of their actions." "I don't want revenge," Clara said quietly. "I just want it to be over." Mrs. Abernathy wrapped one of her blankets around Clara's shoulders, her motherly face creased with concern. "Nonsense, dear. What Marcus did was unforgivable. You can't just let him get away with it." "I'm not letting him get away with anything," Clara replied. "I'm choosing not to let his hatred poison my future the way it's poisoned his." Nathan squeezed her shoulders, his voice warm with pride and love. "Where will you stay tonight?" "My place isn't much, but—" "Actually," Mayor Whitman interrupted, "the town council has been discussing something that might be relevant. Mrs. Patterson, your speech at the festival has had quite an impact on people throughout the valley. We've had requests from other communities asking if you'd be willing to visit them, to share your story with folks who are struggling with their own troubles." Clara blinked in surprise. "What are you saying?" We're saying the town would like to sponsor you as a traveling speaker if you're interested. We'd provide transportation, lodging, and a modest salary. You'd be helping people while representing Millbrook Valley's commitment to healing and community support. Nathan's arms tightened around Clara, and she could feel his excitement even before he spoke. Clara, that's perfect. You found your calling. But what about us? Clara asked, looking up at him with sudden worry. If I'm traveling... Nathan smiled, the expression transforming his soot-streaked face into something radiant. Then I guess I'll have to come with you. I'm pretty handy with metalwork, and every community needs a blacksmith. We could travel together, help people together, build a life that isn't tied to any one place. Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. You'd do that? Leave everything behind to travel with me? Clara, you are everything. The rest is just geography. As her cabin continued to burn behind them, as the townspeople worked to contain the flames and plan their pursuit of Marcus Patterson, Clara felt the last chains of her old life fall away. The scared, guilty woman who had hidden in that cabin was gone, consumed by the same flames that had tried to destroy her 4 years ago. In her place stood someone new, a woman who had survived not one fire but 2, who had learned to transform pain into purpose, who had discovered that love could indeed heal the deepest wounds. The fire burned throughout the night, and Clara and Nathan stood together watching it, planning their future as wandering healers who would carry their hard-won wisdom to anyone who needed it. When dawn finally came, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, nothing remained of Clara's cabin but ash and memory. But from those ashes, something new was being born, a partnership that would touch countless lives, a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. Marcus Patterson was captured 2 days later at the county line, drunk and weeping over what he'd done. But by then, Clara and Nathan had already begun planning their new life together, and Marcus's fate seemed less important than the future they were building from the ruins of the past. Some stories, Clara realized, could only end in fire, but the best ones were also reborn from it. 6 months later, Clara stood on the steps of a small church in Cedar Falls, watching Nathan adjust the harness on their traveling wagon. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, and she could hear the sounds of the town waking up, shopkeepers opening their doors, children playing in nearby yards, the distant rowing of cattle being driven to pasture. Their wagon was a marvel of practical engineering, designed by Nathan to serve as both transportation and mobile workshop. One side opened to reveal his portable forge and metalworking tools, while the other had been fitted with a small living space, complete with a fold-down bed and storage for their belongings. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home in the truest sense, a place where they belonged together, wherever their travels might take them, ready for another day of changing lives? Nathan asked with a grin, securing the last of his tools in their designated spots. Clara adjusted the flame pendant at her throat, now accompanied by a simple gold wedding band that Nathan had crafted for their ceremony 2 months prior. As ready as anyone can be for the unknown, their wedding had been a quiet affair held in the ruins of Clara's burned cabin, with only a handful of close friends in attendance. Mrs. Abernathy had wept through the entire ceremony, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed. Mayor Whitman had officiated, pronouncing them partners not just in marriage, but in their mission to bring healing to broken communities throughout the territory. The past 6 months had transformed them both in ways Clara could never have imagined. They'd traveled to 12 different settlements, sharing their story and Nathan's practical skills wherever they were needed. Clara had spoken to gatherings large and small, helping people process grief, guilt, and trauma with the hard-won wisdom of her own survival. Nathan had not only provided metalwork services, but had proven surprisingly gifted at counseling men who struggled to express their pain, veterans of various wars, widowers, fathers who'd lost children to disease or accident. Together, they'd developed a reputation as unconventional healers who offered practical solutions alongside emotional support. Communities would send word ahead of their arrival, and they'd often find crowds gathered to hear Clara speak and watch Nathan transform raw metal into beautiful, functional art. This morning brought a special challenge. They'd been asked to visit the Navajo Reservation 20 miles east of Cedar Falls. The tribal council had specifically requested Clara's presence to help their community process a recent tragedy, a flash flood that had swept away several homes and killed 3 children. The survivors were struggling with questions of fate, responsibility, and how to continue living after such devastating loss. Clara had been nervous about accepting the invitation, unsure how her experiences would translate across cultural boundaries. But Nathan had reminded her that grief was universal, that the human heart spoke the same language of pain, regardless of the color of skin or the specific traditions surrounding it. Besides, he'd added with the gentle wisdom that had become his trademark, they didn't ask for a white woman to tell them how to grieve. They asked for someone who understands surviving the unsurvivable. That's exactly who you are. As they prepared to leave Cedar Falls, Clara reflected on how different this departure felt from all the others. In the early days of their travels, she'd still carried traces of the old fears, anxiety about speaking to strangers, worry that people would reject her message, lingering shame about her scars and her story. But with each community they'd served, with each person whose eyes had lit up with recognition when she described the journey from despair to hope, Clara had grown more confident in her purpose. She was no longer the broken woman who'd hidden in a cabin for 3 years. She wasn't even the tentatively healing woman who'd first allowed Nathan to see her scars. She was someone entirely new, a person forged by fire and tempered by love, strong enough to carry others' burdens without being crushed by their weight. The journey to the reservation took them through some of the most beautiful country Clara had ever seen. Red rock formations jutted from the desert floor like ancient monuments, and the vast sky seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Nathan had packed their lunch, and they stopped at midday beside a clear stream to rest the horses and share a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried fruit. "Penny for your thoughts," Nathan said, settling beside Clara on a flat boulder that overlooked the water. "I was thinking about time," Clara replied, watching the stream flow past them toward some distant destination. "About how strange it is that the worst thing that ever happened to me led directly to the best thing that ever happened to me." Nathan was quiet for a moment, understanding as always that Clara needed space to work through her thoughts. "Do you think it was worth it? All the pain, all the years of hiding? Was it worth it to end up here?" The question was one Clara had grappled with many times during their travels. "I don't think it works that way," she said finally. "I don't think suffering is valuable because of where it leads. The fire that killed Thomas and scarred me wasn't good because it eventually brought us together. It was still a tragedy, still a loss that changed the world in irreparable ways." She picked up a small stone and tossed it into the stream, watching the ripples spread outward in concentric circles. "But I do think we have the power to transform our pain into something meaningful. Not to justify what happened, but to ensure it serves some purpose beyond just making us miserable." Nathan reached for her hand, intertwining their scarred fingers, in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "And what purpose has your pain served?" Clara smiled, thinking of all the faces they'd encountered in their travels, the grieving widow in Silver Creek who'd thanked Clara for giving her permission to be angry at God, the scarred veteran in Tombstone who'd cried when Nathan showed him that marked flesh could still create beauty, the young mother in Paradise Valley who'd stopped blaming herself for her child's death after hearing Clara's story. "It served love," she said simply. "All of it. The fire, the hiding, the shame, the healing, even Marcus's attack. It's all somehow served love in the end." They reached the reservation as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. Clara was struck immediately by the quiet dignity of the place. Children playing traditional games in the dusty spaces between homes, women working together to prepare food for the evening meal, men gathered in serious conversation about matters that clearly held great weight. Joseph Yazzie, a member of the tribal council who had extended their invitation, met them at the edge of the settlement. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with silver threading through his long black hair and eyes that held depths of both sorrow and wisdom. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, using Clara's married name with formal courtesy. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for coming. Our people are struggling with questions that have no easy answers." As Joseph led them toward the center of the community, Clara could see the evidence of the recent flood. Repaired foundations, new construction where homes had been swept away, and most tellingly, the hollow expressions in many eyes that spoke of grief too fresh to have found any resolution. That evening, the entire community gathered in a large clearing, surrounded by traditional hogans and more modern structures. A fire had been built in the center, not for warmth, but for the symbolic power of light pushing back darkness. Clara felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at the sight of the flames, but it was manageable now, transformed from paralyzing fear into respectful awareness. Joseph introduced Clara and Nathan to the assembled crowd, explaining their unconventional mission and their reputation for helping communities process collective trauma. Then he stepped back, leaving Clara to face perhaps her most challenging audience yet. "I want to begin by acknowledging that I come to you as an outsider," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly in the still desert air. "I don't pretend to understand your specific traditions or the particular ways your culture approaches grief and healing. What I can offer is the story of my own journey through loss and the things I've learned about surviving when survival feels impossible." She paused, studying the faces around the fire. Many were openly skeptical, which Clara had expected. Others showed polite attention that might or might not indicate genuine interest. But scattered throughout the crowd were expressions of desperate hope. People so wounded by recent events that they were willing to listen to anyone who might offer even the smallest comfort. 3 months ago, you lost 3 children to a flood that came without warning. I know some of you are asking yourselves whether you could have done something differently, whether their deaths were somehow your fault. Others are angry at forces beyond your control, at the weather, at fate, at whatever powers govern the universe. Still others are wondering how they're supposed to continue living in a world where such terrible things can happen to innocent children. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Clara could see recognition dawning in many eyes. She was describing feelings they'd all experienced, but perhaps hadn't yet found words for. 4 years ago, I lost my husband in a house fire. Like your flood, it came suddenly and changed everything in a matter of minutes. Also like your flood, it left me asking questions that had no good answers. Clara touched the flame pendant at her throat, drawing strength from its familiar weight. I spent 3 years believing that my survival was a mistake, that I should have died alongside him, that living without him was a betrayal of our love. She gestured toward Nathan, who sat at the edge of the circle with his tools nearby, ready to offer his own gifts to the community when the time was right. This man taught me something important about grief and healing. He taught me that we don't have to choose between honoring our dead and embracing life. That survival, even survival that comes with scars, even survival that feels undeserved, can be its own form of love. An elderly woman near the front of the group raised her hand hesitantly. When Clara nodded encouragingly, she spoke in accented but clear English. "How do we live with guilt? My granddaughter was one who died, and I keep thinking, if I had been watching more carefully, if I had seen the water rising sooner." Clara felt her heart clench with recognition. "What's your name?" Margaret began. "Margaret, may I ask you something? If your granddaughter were here now, if she could speak to you about your guilt, what do you think she would say?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she answered without hesitation. "She would tell me not to blame myself. She would say she knows I loved her, that I did my best to keep her safe. And would she be right?" "Yes," Margaret whispered. "Then maybe the question isn't whether you deserve to feel guilty, but whether carrying that guilt serves your granddaughter's memory in any meaningful way." Clara's voice was gentle but firm. "Margaret, I spent 3 years punishing myself for surviving when my husband didn't. I thought suffering was the only way to prove my love for him, but suffering didn't bring him back, and it didn't honor the life he'd wanted me to live." Clara stood and walked to where Margaret sat, kneeling beside the older woman with careful respect. "Your granddaughter is gone, and that's a tragedy that will echo through your family for generations. But you're still here. Your love for her is still here. Your memories of her are still here. Those things matter, Margaret. Those things have power to create good in the world, if you let them." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with various community members sharing their fears, their anger, their confusion about how to move forward. Clara found herself drawing on not just her own experiences, but the stories of all the people she and Nathan had met in their travels. A growing collection of proof that healing was possible even after the most devastating losses. When the formal discussion concluded, Nathan opened his portable forge and began working on a special project he'd planned for this visit. As the crowd watched in fascination, he shaped metal into a memorial sculpture, 3 small figures representing the lost children, their forms intertwined with symbols of water and sky in a design that spoke to both tragedy and transcendence. "This will remain here always," he said as he worked, his voice mixing with the rhythmic sound of hammer on metal. "Not to remind you of your pain, but to honor the love that makes the pain so sharp. These children mattered. Their lives had meaning. Their loss leaves a mark on the world that can never be erased. But that mark doesn't have to be only about sorrow." As the evening wound toward its close, Joseph Yazzie approached Clara with an expression of deep gratitude. "You have given our people something precious tonight," he said. "Not answers. I don't think there are easy answers to questions like these. But you've given them permission to carry their grief without being crushed by it." Clara felt the familiar warmth that came with knowing she'd served her purpose well. "They gave me something too. Every community we visit teaches me something new about the many faces of love and loss." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to their camp. Marcus Patterson appeared as Clara and Nathan were preparing to continue their journey, riding alone and looking years older than the 6 months that had passed since his attack on Clara's cabin. Nathan immediately moved to place himself between Marcus and Clara, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. But Clara stepped around her husband, studying Marcus with eyes that had learned to see beneath surfaces. "Hello, Marcus," she said quietly. Marcus dismounted slowly, his movements those of a man who carried invisible weights. "Clara, I heard you were here. I've been looking for you. If you've come to cause more trouble," Nathan began, but Clara raised a hand to stop him. "What do you want, Marcus?" she asked. Marcus stood awkwardly beside his horse, clearly struggling with whatever had brought him to this meeting. "I want to apologize," he said finally, "and to ask for your help." The request surprised Clara, though perhaps it shouldn't. In their travels, she'd learned that people who seemed irredeemably angry were often the ones most desperately in need of healing. I've been drinking myself to death since that night, Marcus continued, his voice rough with shame. Can't sleep, can't work, can't think about anything but what I did to you. The guilt is eating me alive. Clara exchanged a glance with Nathan, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his amber eyes. This was why they traveled, why they'd chosen. This unconventional life, for moments like this, when someone who seemed beyond redemption revealed themselves to be simply another wounded soul seeking healing. Marcus, Clara said gently, what do you think Thomas would say if he could see you now? Marcus's face crumpled with anguish. He'd be ashamed of me. He'd say I dishonored his memory by trying to hurt you in his name. And what would he want you to do now? I don't know, Marcus whispered. I don't know how to live with what I've become. Clara moved closer, her hand coming to rest on Marcus's shoulder in a gesture of compassion that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. The same way I learned to live with what I'd become. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of healing at a time. What followed was a conversation that lasted most of the morning, Marcus finally giving voice to years of suppressed grief over his brother's death, his guilt at not being there to help, his fear that Thomas's memory was fading from the world. Clara and Nathan listened without judgment, offering the same patient support they'd given to countless others who carried burdens too heavy for one person to bear alone. By midday, Marcus had agreed to join them for the next leg of their journey. Not permanently, he had his own healing work to do, but long enough to begin processing his grief in healthy ways and to make amends for the harm he'd caused. I can't undo what I did, he said, as they prepared to leave the reservation. I can't give you back your cabin or take away the fear I caused you. No, Clara agreed. But you can choose to transform your pain into something that serves love instead of hate. That's all any of us can do, Marcus. That's all any of us ever could do. As their wagon rolled away from the reservation toward whatever community next needed their services, Clara reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. She'd begun this journey as a woman hiding from her scars, convinced that her damage made her unworthy of love or happiness. Now she was someone who helped others transform their own wounds into sources of strength. The work wasn't easy. Every community brought new challenges, new forms of trauma that tested Clara's ability to find hope in the midst of despair. But it was work that mattered, work that honored both Thomas's memory and Nathan's faith in her capacity for healing. Any regrets? Nathan asked as they settled into the rhythm of travel, Marcus riding silently beside their wagon as he began his own journey toward redemption. Clara touched her scars through the fabric of her dress, feeling the familiar texture of healed skin that would never be smooth again. Then she reached for Nathan's scarred hand, intertwining their fingers in the gesture that had become their signature of mutual acceptance. None, she said simply. Not about any of it. The pain, the hiding, the healing, the love, all of it led us here, to this life, to this purpose. I can't regret the path that brought us to where we belong. The desert stretched endlessly before them, filled with communities that needed their particular gifts, people who required proof that broken things could indeed be beautiful. Clara and Nathan had found their calling in the spaces between settlements, in the territory that belonged to wanderers and healers, to those who had learned to transform scars into stories of hope. Behind them, the sun cast their shadows long across the red earth. Ahead, the future waited with all its unknowable challenges and possibilities, and in the wagon that carried them toward whatever came next, two people who had been broken by fire continued the sacred work of helping others rise from the ashes of their own devastation. Some love stories, Clara thought as the miles rolled, beneath their wheels, were written in flames, but the very best ones were reborn from them, stronger and more beautiful than anything that had come before. In the end, That was the only story that really mattered, not the tale of what fire could destroy, but the testament to what love could create from the ruins. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the frontier town of Silver Ridge, carried by a dusty rider who'd traveled 3 days to deliver it. Clara accepted the envelope with hands that no longer trembled at unexpected visitors, her fingers steady as she broke the wax seal bearing the official stamp of the territorial governor. Nathan looked up from the horseshoe he was shaping, concerned, flickering across his weathered features. In their years of traveling together, official correspondence usually meant either recognition for their work or requests to handle increasingly difficult situations. Communities devastated by disasters, mining accidents, or conflicts between settlers and native tribes. "What does it say?" he asked, setting down his hammer. Clara's eyes widened as she scanned the formal script. "They want us in the territorial capital. Governor Morrison is establishing a new program. Official trauma counselors to work with communities throughout the Western Territories. He's offering us positions as the first regional coordinators." Marcus Patterson, now a permanent member of their small traveling group, looked up from where he was organizing their medical supplies. The past 3 years had transformed Thomas's brother almost beyond recognition. The bitter, alcohol-ravaged man had become someone thoughtful and dedicated, his own journey through grief having given him remarkable insights into helping others navigate similar darkness. "That's quite an honor," Marcus said quietly, "though I imagine it would mean settling down somewhere." The prospect should have excited Clara, but instead she felt an unexpected flutter of uncertainty. Their nomadic life had become precious to her. The freedom to move from one community to another, never staying long enough to become entangled in local politics or expectations, always arriving as strangers who could speak truths that long-time residents might find difficult to voice at a... "Do you think?" she asked Nathan, who had abandoned his work entirely to study her expression. "I think," Nathan said carefully, "that we should visit the capital and hear what they're proposing before we make any decisions. This could be a chance to help more people than we ever could traveling from town to town." 3 weeks later, they found themselves in the governor's mansion, an imposing stone building that seemed wildly out of place in the rough frontier capital. Governor Morrison proved to be a surprisingly down-to-earth man in his 50s, his formal attire unable to disguise the calloused hands and sun-weathered face of someone who'd worked his way up from humble beginnings. "Mrs. and Mr. Brooks," he said, rising from behind an enormous oak desk to greet them personally. "Your reputation precedes you. I've received letters from mayors, tribal councils, and private citizens across the territory, all praising your unconventional but remarkably effective methods." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the praise, still not entirely comfortable with the recognition their work had garnered. "We simply share our own experiences, Governor. Nothing more complicated than that." Perhaps not complicated, but certainly rare. Governor Morrison gestured for them to sit in comfortable leather chairs arranged near a large window overlooking the bustling capital. Most people who survive trauma either hide from it or let it harden them into bitterness. You've somehow managed to transform your pain into a gift for others. The governor outlined his vision, a network of trained counselors who could be dispatched quickly to communities facing crisis, providing immediate support while helping local leaders develop long-term healing strategies. Clara and Nathan would oversee the training of new counselors, develop standardized approaches that could be adapted to different cultural contexts, and continue their own fieldwork in the most challenging situations. The position would come with a substantial salary, a permanent residence here in the capital, and resources to expand your work beyond anything you could accomplish on your own, Governor Morrison explained. "We're talking about the potential to help thousands of people across the entire Western Territory." It was, by any measure, an extraordinary opportunity. Yet Clara found herself thinking not of the grand scale of impact, but of the intimate moments that had defined their traveling years. Sitting beside a grieving mother in a one-room cabin, watching Nathan craft a memorial sculpture for a family who'd lost everything, seeing Marcus comfort a veteran whose nightmares mirrored his own former demons. "Could we have some time to consider the offer?" Nathan asked, his diplomatic tone not quite hiding his own ambivalence. "Of course. Take all the time you need. The territory has waited this long for a comprehensive approach to trauma care. We can wait a bit longer for the right people to lead it." That evening, Clara and Nathan walked through the capital streets, observing the mix of rough frontier, energy, and emerging civilization that characterized most growing Western towns. Electric streetlights had recently been installed along the main thoroughfare, casting an alien glow that seemed to promise a future very different from the world they'd known. "It's a generous offer," Nathan said as they paused beside a fountain in the town square, the kind of opportunity that could change countless lives. "But," Clara prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice, "but I keep thinking about old Maria Santos in Desert Springs, how she lit up when you sat with her for 3 hours, talking about her son who died in the Apache Wars, or young Timothy Mueller in Pine Valley, how he finally started speaking again, after I let him help me forge a new bell for their church." Clara nodded, understanding immediately. Individual connections, personal healing, the kind of work that can't be systematized or scaled up without losing something essential. They stood in comfortable silence, watching late evening stragglers make their way home from saloons and gaming houses. The capital buzzed with ambition and growth, but it lacked the intimate community spirit of the smaller settlements where they'd done their most meaningful work. "There's something else," Clara said eventually. "Marcus," Nathan's expression grew thoughtful. "You're worried about how a permanent position might affect his recovery. He's come so far, but his healing is still tied to our traveling life. The constant movement, the ability to reinvent himself in each new place, the satisfaction of helping others without having to confront his own past every day. I'm not sure how he'd handle settling down permanently." As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus appeared around the corner, his long coat flapping in the evening breeze. He'd been exploring the capital on his own, taking in the sights and sounds of the largest town any of them had visited. "Find anything interesting?" Nathan asked, as Marcus joined them beside the fountain. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the electric streetlights, with an expression Clara had learned to recognize as his way of working through complex thoughts. "I've been thinking about something Thomas used to say," Marcus said finally. "He always claimed that the best way to honor the dead wasn't to build monuments to them, but to live in ways that would make them proud." Clara felt her throat tighten at the unexpected mention of her first husband. Even after all these years, after all the healing and growth, Thomas remained a presence in their lives, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of love's enduring power. "What do you think he'd say about the governor's offer?" she asked quietly. Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features in ways that reminded Clara powerfully of his brother. "I think Thomas would say that grand titles and official positions matter less than staying true to what actually helps people heal. He was always suspicious of folks who talked more about helping than they actually helped." "And what do you think would help people more?" Nathan asked. "A formal program with resources and official backing, or continuing to travel where we're needed most?" "Maybe," Marcus said slowly, "the answer isn't choosing one or the other. Maybe it's finding a way to do both." Over the following days, the three of them worked together to develop a counter-proposal for Governor Morrison. Instead of settling permanently in the capital, they suggested a hybrid arrangement. Clara and Nathan would spend part of each year training new counselors and developing resources while continuing their traveling work during the rest of the time. They would establish a network of communication that allowed them to respond quickly to crisis situations while building long-term capacity in communities across the territory. Governor Morrison proved surprisingly receptive to their alternative vision. "Frankly," he admitted during their final meeting, "I was hoping you'd suggest something like this. A purely bureaucratic approach to trauma care would miss the essential human element that makes your work so effective." The agreement they ultimately reached reflected the wisdom they'd gained from 3 years of wandering. Healing couldn't be systematized or administered from afar, but individual healers could be supported, trained, and coordinated in ways that multiplied their impact without diminishing their effectiveness. Clara's role would involve not just training other trauma counselors, but developing educational materials that could help communities understand and respond to collective grief. Nathan would teach practical skills, not just metalworking, but carpentry, leatherwork, and other crafts that allowed people to process emotions through the creation of beautiful, useful objects. Marcus, whose own transformation had become legendary in the circles where their reputation was known, would specialize in working with people whose trauma manifested as anger, addiction, or self-destruction. 6 months later, Clara found herself standing before the largest audience of her speaking career. Nearly 300 people gathered in the territorial capital's new civic center for the inaugural Western Trauma Care Conference. Representatives from dozens of communities had traveled to learn about new approaches to healing, and Clara had been chosen to deliver the keynote address. But instead of feeling nervous, as she had before her first public speech in Millbrook Valley, Clara felt calm and centered. She wore a new dress Nathan had commissioned for the occasion, deep green silk with intricate embroidery that deliberately incorporated patterns reminiscent of flame and renewal. Her scars were clearly visible, above the neckline, no longer hidden but displayed as proudly as medals earned in battle. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the large hall, "I want to begin by telling you about a woman I met last month in the mining town of Copper Creek. Her name was Ruth Blackwood, and she'd lost her husband and 2 children in a cave-in at the local mine." Clara went on to describe Ruth's journey through rage, despair, and ultimately toward a fragile but growing acceptance of her losses. She spoke about the importance of witnessing people's pain without trying to fix it, about the healing power of practical skills and creative expression, about the way communities could support individual recovery while processing their own collective trauma. But what made her speech different from the many others she'd given over the years was its scope and sophistication. 3 years of traveling had given Clara a deep understanding of how trauma manifested differently across various cultures, economic situations, and types of loss. She spoke with the authority of someone who had not just survived her own devastation, but had helped hundreds of others navigate theirs. When she finished, the applause lasted several minutes, but what moved Clara most were the faces in the audience. People who'd found hope in her words, recognition in her descriptions of the healing journey, practical ideas they could take back to their own communities. After the conference, Clara and Nathan returned to their traveling life with renewed purpose and enhanced resources. The territorial government provided them with improved equipment, better transportation, and a network of communication that allowed them to coordinate with other healers across the vast Western landscape. But the most significant change was in Clara herself. The frightened, scarred woman who had once hidden in a remote cabin had become someone who could address governors and tribal councils with equal comfort, who could adapt her message to reach anyone from grieving children to hardened miners, who had learned to see her own survival as just the beginning of a much larger story about the human capacity for transformation. One evening, as they camped beside a stream in the mountains between settlements, Nathan looked up from the letter he was writing to Governor Morrison about their latest successes. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Marcus hadn't burned down your cabin?" he asked. Clara, who was mending a tear in one of their traveling bags, considered the question seriously. "You mean, would we have ended up here anyway?" "Exactly. Was this path inevitable once we found each other? Or did Marcus's attack somehow catalyze something that might not have happened otherwise?" Clara set down her needlework and looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. After so many years of thinking about healing and transformation, she'd developed strong opinions about the role of crisis in personal growth. "I don't think we would have traveled if I'd still had the cabin to hide in," she said finally. "As much as I'd learned to accept your love, as much progress as I'd made in healing, I was still fundamentally afraid of the world. Marcus forcing me out of that safe space, however violently he did it, created the opportunity for me to discover I was stronger than I'd ever imagined." Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "So in a strange way, his attempt to destroy your new life actually completed your transformation. Marcus would probably say that's giving him too much credit for what was essentially a selfish act of revenge," Clara replied with a small smile. "But yes, I think the fire that was meant to end my story actually freed me to begin writing a completely different one." As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus appeared from the darkness beyond their fire, returning from his evening routine of checking on their horses and securing their camp against potential wildlife intrusions. "What are you two philosophizing about now?" he asked, with the easy familiarity of someone who'd shared countless such evenings around countless similar fires. "The role of destruction in creation," Nathan replied. "Whether breaking something is sometimes necessary for it to become what it's meant to be." Marcus settled beside the fire, his expression growing serious in the way it always did when conversations turned to deeper matters. "I've thought about that a lot over the years, about whether I was destroying Clara's life or somehow setting her free when I burned down that cabin." "What conclusion did you reach?" Clara asked gently. "That my intentions don't matter as much as what we all chose to do with the consequences." Marcus poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the stars. "I acted out of hatred and wanted to cause harm. You chose to respond with grace and found a way to transform that harm into healing. The fire itself was just fire. What mattered was how we all decided to relate to what it left behind." Clara felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. Not the heat of flames, but the glow of deep satisfaction that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the people who understood her most completely. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I need you to know something. What you did that night was wrong, and it caused real harm. But the path it set me on, the life I've been able to build because of being forced out of hiding, has brought me more joy and purpose than I ever could have imagined possible." Marcus looked up from the fire, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Are you saying you're grateful I burned down your home?" Clara laughed, the sound carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I'm saying I'm grateful for the life that emerged from those ashes. The difference might seem subtle, but it's everything." As the fire burned lower and the three of them prepared for another night under the vast western sky, Clara reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this place. She'd begun as a woman convinced that her scars marked her as unworthy of love, that her survival was a cosmic mistake that needed to be hidden from the world. Now she was someone who wore her scars proudly, who had learned to transform her deepest wounds into sources of strength for others, who had discovered that broken things could indeed become more beautiful than they'd ever been whole. The work would continue tomorrow, and the day after that, and for as long as communities needed what They had learned to offer. There would be new tragedies to witness, new forms of pain to understand, new opportunities to prove that healing was possible, even in the aftermath of devastating loss. But tonight, beside a campfire in the wilderness, surrounded by the two men who had become her chosen family, Clara Patterson Brooks allowed herself to feel something she'd never expected to experience again: complete and perfect contentment with the life she had built from the ruins of the one she'd lost. Some stories ended in fire. The best ones were reborn from it, stronger and more luminous than anything that had come before. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.